Hello, I'm Max Bergmann. I'm the director of the Europe-Russia Eurasia Program here at CSIS, and I'm here to talk about a new report that I have out with Otto Svendsen called How Europe Can Defend Itself with Less America. The whole rationale behind writing this report is that the US has a new strategy, new approach to Europe, from burden sharing to burden shifting. The administration is quite intent on shifting the burden of European security to Europe and to Europeans. As Secretary of Defense Hegseth said at the NATO summit, the US can't have the expectation of being Europe's permanent guarantor. And what we're now expecting is a new force posture review coming out from the administration, which will likely signal shifts in US posture in Europe, likely force reductions. And Europe's focus on spending, as was done at the NATO summit when Europe increased its defense spending, or announced increases of defense spending to 3.5% and 5%, mask a broader challenge. And this is what the paper seeks to point out, are the gaps that the US could create if it significantly pulls back from European security. And so what this paper tries to do is look at the gaps that would be created and what does Europe need to do to begin to think about defending itself with less America. That is the purpose of the report, and so let's dive in. So the first thing to look at is, what is the US force posture in Europe? The US has troops throughout Europe, largely in Germany, where the US has roughly 40,000 troops. It has additionally surged forces into Eastern Europe. In Poland, there's roughly 14,000 troops, and small amounts in Estonia, Lithuania, and Romania. There has actually been a recent announcement of the US pulling back forces from Romania. These forces here on the eastern flank are rotational forces. They're easier to take out. Troops have been deployed without their family, not on a permanent basis. These forces here are more on a permanent basis. But the key point for European defense is that the forces here in Europe serve essentially as Europe's response force. That if the Russians were to come over the line into Estonia, the US would quickly react, and there's been a lot of effort to figure out how to get the forces in Germany into the Baltic states to protect the Baltic states. So, if the US draws down its ground forces in Europe significantly, that creates a potential real security gap for Europe. Let's go to the next slide. So let's also look at US, European, and Russian military capabilities. And here, there's actually, I think, some bright spots for Europe. While the United States is by far the strongest military, it's clear that Europe also has lots of military assets. It has lots of bombers, fighters, advanced aircraft, and also is doing quite well in the maritime domain, at least vis-a-vis Russia. Now, where Europe tends to have more issues is when it comes to things called enablers, critical enablers, which enable Europe and NATO to fight effectively. These involve air tankers, air transport, so air tankers to keep fighter jets aloft in the air, transport planes to get troops from maybe Western Europe over to Eastern Europe very quickly. And here is where Europe is, has a decent amount of air transport planes and some air tankers, but is really reliant on the United States to provide a lot of that capability. And it's even more true when we get into things like satellite communications, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, where Europe, in some cases, is just entirely dependent on the United States. Part of what we assessed in this paper is that when it comes to critical enablers, there's sort of no short-term fix for Europe. It's going to have to rely on the United States as it begins to develop its own capabilities. But what we did is we looked at 5 tasks that Europe needs to do to build some redundancy and build its strength and be able to fight as Europe. First, it needs to figure out how to replace those ground forces. So if the US does significantly pull back US ground forces, how does Europe have its own ability to respond to Russia if it were to come across into Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania or any other European state? The second problem is that Europeans all don't operate the same equipment. Now, a lot of this equipment is interoperable, but it's not necessarily interchangeable. This creates real problems for Europeans because if they were all to deploy together with all these different countries operating different vehicles, different aircraft, different systems, it creates a maintenance and logistical challenge for Europe to deploy and fight together. And the Ukrainians have experienced this firsthand because they've gotten a lot of hand-me-down European equipment, and that has put huge strain on Ukraine's ability to keep this equipment in the fight by simply repairing and replacing. So Europeans need to begin to streamline the equipment that they have and to concentrate their equipment so they're operating more as an integrated force. And the third is expand stockpiles. Europeans may have a lot of aircraft, but the munitions that they need for that aircraft, for those tanks, is in a relatively short supply. Much of that is going to Ukraine, quite appropriately, but Europe needs to build stockpiles, especially given what we've seen with Russia's ability to absorb tremendous amounts of casualties. So if Europe were to fight an initial wave, might expend a lot of its ammunition, and then the Russians may lose a lot of forces, but may be able to keep coming with Europe having essentially run out of ammunition. So that's a big problem. It needs to mitigate dependencies on U.S. enablers. I talked about this briefly, but this is going to be a big, more medium to long-term challenge. And the fifth is build redundant command structures. So the U.S. is central in NATO. The U.S. basically runs the NATO alliance. So if the U.S. is not going to actively participate in a European war, and it is worth noting that President Trump at the NATO summit, when asked about his commitment to Article 5, did not say the U.S. was not committed to Article 5, but he did note it depends on your definition. And what I think Europeans may need to interpret from that is that the U.S. can uphold its Article 5 commitments by supporting Europe the same way it's supporting Ukraine, sending munitions, providing intelligence sharing, maybe some of these critical enablers, does not necessarily involve U.S. forces fighting the war. And so I think it is worth Europeans considering, would it trust American commanders if the American commanders don't have Americans fighting alongside Europeans? Perhaps, but it may also want redundant structures, and this involves potentially looking at the European Union as well as the Coalition of the Willing, or beginning to Europeanize NATO's command structures in a more assertive way than is currently being done. But let's dive into a couple of these quickly. So the first, I think the biggest recommendation that we make in this paper is to point forward how Europe can replace U.S. ground forces. What we call for is to utilize Europe's collective scale and capacity to create a permanently deployed pan-European force comprising, we call for 100,000 troops, of the highest readiness, able to quickly respond to crises. And so the key point here is that Europe needs to begin to utilize its scale. In particular, if you look at the armies in Southern Europe, in Spain and Italy, Spain has 122,000 troops in its army, Italy 160,000. Now Spain at the NATO summit got a lot of grief, perhaps understandably, for refusing to commit to spend 3.5%. Spain's response is, we're not going to be able to meet that commitment. Many other countries aren't going to be able to meet that commitment. We're not going to make a spending commitment that we have no intention of meeting. And I think that's an understandable position, but I think what is necessary is to think of tangible asks that can be made of countries and how can they contribute to the defense of Europe. And one idea, and what we throw out in this paper, is to take some of these armies and permanently deploy them in either Eastern Europe or in Germany, so that you then create the framework for a pan-European force. That is what Germany is currently doing in Lithuania with permanently deployed troops, and that's what U.S. forces that are permanently deployed in Germany do. So maybe you could take the scale and size of Spain and Italy, put them in a more centralized position, and then perhaps use the EU budget and other mechanisms to help build out this force. And then you could have other countries contribute. But the essential goal here is to think about how Europe can use its scale to defend itself if the United States is not there. So if the United States is not acting as Europe's rapid reaction force, Europe may need to create a rapid reaction force. Germany is looking at building one of the biggest armies in Europe. That's great, but other European countries should be asked to do something similar, and that's what we throw out here. This is a big, bold proposal, will be very controversial. But it is time for Europe to begin to think a bit more outside the box, and it's fairly in line with what has been proposed by the European Union and by NATO in the past. But the big difference is that instead of making this a rotational force, make it permanent. The second thing is to operate the same equipment. Now, the good news here is that the EU is starting to do this with a program called SAFE. It's a €150 billion loan program to incentivize Europeans to buy the same equipment. But this could be done at a bigger scale. One option is to borrow. The EU borrowed in response to COVID, and if you could borrow jointly in response to COVID to have economic growth, you can borrow in response to war. So the EU could go to capital markets, borrow tomorrow at a AAA credit rating, have a huge stockpile of money, which it could then use to buy equipment to boost its defense industrial production, both for Ukraine, but also to set the basis for a future more integrated European militaries. And the second, this is a proposal thrown out by the think tank Bruegel in Brussels, which I think has a lot of merit, is to create a new European procurement authority, essentially have the European Union or a collection of European states begin to integrate procurement. There are essentially 27 different Pentagons within the EU, all with different procurement offices within their ministries of defense, and begin to integrate and coordinate defense procurement, particularly at higher end systems where Europe is not necessarily producing at scale and not getting the economies of scale. So they're not getting the bang for the euro that they should get. And finally is to expand stockpiles. Now this is relatively, in some ways, straightforward. They need to buy more of lots of things that go boom. They need to buy more artillery ammunition, long-range strike capabilities, as well as UAVs, not just the small variety that Ukraine is really operating, but also UAVs that can really contribute to intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. And missile defense systems and interceptors, this is a huge challenge. Ukraine is experiencing this as well, and Europe should really boost its investment in its own indigenous capabilities there as well, and lastly, armored vehicles. So finally, what we sort of conclude with is that Europe has done a lot of pan-European reports about how Europe boosts its economic competitiveness, how Europe can boost its economic growth, how to strengthen its single market, how to boost its resilience, in a report by the former Finnish president Niinistö. It needs a Draghi-style report on defense. It needs to start thinking more holistically and clearly about how Europe can defend itself with less America. That could be done at NATO, but the problem is the United States is so central to NATO, it is hard for Europeans to think about their collective defense without us. And frankly, that is what the Trump administration has been asking Europeans to do, and I think it's time that Europeans start really doing that. They have been doing that on the defense industrial side, and the EU has put forth a number of papers, but to think more broadly about how does Europe defend itself if the United States is not going to be there as the backbone of European defense. It requires lots of changes, lots of reforms, lots of things that ministries of defense don't really want to deal with because it would require bureaucratic change, but it's probably necessary for the security of Europe. Thank you very much.